Isaiah wandered the swamp for hours, crushed by an overwhelming loss. His mind could not release the gruesome image of his Kawana's slender, eviscerated neck. Overcome by his grief, Isaiah had been unaware of the elegantly attired, delicate creature perched among the mangroves. He failed to notice just how enraptured she had become with his human essence, beautifully pulsating with the life force she could not help but crave. As Isaiah slowly became aware of his surroundings, he found himself standing knee-deep in the murky water of the swamp. The sun had all but disappeared below the horizon. Long shadows filled the silence. He forced his eyes to adjust, impatiently wiping away his tears. He fixated upon an erratic movement just below the muddy surface, careening in his direction. As an alligator surfaced, jaws gaping in anticipation, Isaiah made no move to evade. Overwhelming exhaustion crushed any thoughts of attempting another escape. He quickly made his peace, believing this world had nothing left to offer. He simply closed his eyes and thought of Kawana. He braved for decimation that never came. A horrendous attack ensued with unearthly screeching, but Isaiah was not in the fray. He tore his eyes wide, recoiling in shock. A fragile-looking beauty was in a frenzy, ripping to shreds an animal that should have been her own demise. Her golden curls were flying, glittering in the fading light. The woman's beautiful clothing was not soaked with the alligator's blood. Torn between fascination and horror, Isaiah found himself perversely drawn to the enchantress, spellbound as she feasted on the animal's blood. He searched her eyes for a sign of humanity, but they were wild and unfocused. Tatianya had mystified Isaiah. Simultaneously, she exuded the stench of death and the aroma of recent birth. He had never seen such large blue eyes. Her golden tresses gently outlined the inviting curve of her rounded hips. Wispy tendrils surrounded those eyes. Even tainted by the alligator's blood, he could see she was breathtaking. He was appalled as he found himself staring at her barely concealed heaving breasts. Aroused by curiosity and his recent neglect, he was ashamed by his desire to caress those creamy white treasures he knew were aching to release a mother's milk. He watched, captivated as she flung the now limp carcass into the farthest reaches of the swamp. She then turned to face him. She bestowed the smile that had robbed many men, young and old, of their freedom. Just as Tatianya began her graceful advance, now lusting after his devastating essence, Isaiah caught a blur of movement out of the corner of his eye. He heard a masculine voice with an unfamiliar accent murmur, "Tatianya, please, not this one." Hot, wet breath on his neck made him shriek in horror.
What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Spencer, doing a little bit of different videos. Obviously, there's no trading cards on the screen, and that's because I'm doing a book review with my girlfriend, Megan. Say hi.
Yes, hello everyone. What? You're laughing at me.
No, you're so formal. We're in hoodies, like we're just hanging out. You know, this isn't like a
Should I be like, hey everyone? What?
Yes, yeah, sure. That's what I do. But no, her mom just got a book published, or not just published, but she had a book published, and she passed it on to me. It's called Night Tastings. You can find it on Amazon. Of course, that link will be in the description down below, and I'll be promoting it in the beginning of my videos. But this is like the formal book review for it. We're going to talk about some of the things that happened in it, and talk what we liked about it, and we'll just go from there. So I'm going to get started because there's something that I really like about this book that I typically don't. It totally breaks the mold for me. I hate knowing things that will happen. It bothers me. So I don't watch movie trailers. I literally do not watch trailers of anything because I feel like it ruins the experience for me. And the first chapter of this book is essentially like an excerpt from book 2. This is going to be a trilogy. Book 2 isn't out yet, and it's wild. Now, there's a couple things that are really interesting about it because you kind of start from this low point, like in the prologue, and it ends up going to this high point. So it kind of follows the typical story structure. You just look so stiff. Just relax. So the typical story structure is like, this peak. It goes up and then it goes down, right? It's this nice little thing where it's like you build up, something happens, and then it goes from there. Well, you start from the low point and then it builds up really high. It builds up really exceptionally high. You know there's a twist coming because you've read the prologue, but it goes to this low point and it gets to this moment where you're like, oh, I kind of understand what's going to happen. I get it. I get, where the low point comes from. But then it builds itself back up. And it builds itself so much where you have no idea where the story is going to become. So in this case, knowing what's going to happen or knowing the idea of what's going to happen, like the general feeling, basically kind of guides you. And you think what's going to happen in these future chapters. And you just have no idea. So before I go into any further, before I bounce it to you, this is a book about vampires. So if you like vampires, Twilight, I guess, is kind of like a decent, not comparison. It's not a one-for-one apples for apples, but in terms of how vampires work, and it's a little more of a like traditional view of like vampires. It's a little bit of a darker view, but yeah, that's kind of how the book goes. So I think that could right there. And I don't read vampire books. The way the story structure works, I think is going to interest a lot of people. But if you like vampires, obviously, you're going to like the book anyways because there's lots of vampires in it.
I agree. I usually don't. I usually don't like books that I know what happens right away. And this book definitely has a lot of plot twists around the corner. And it is a vampire book, but it's also a vampire romance book as well. It starts off not knowing there's two young lovers who are trying to be together but don't know if they'll be able to be together, so that sets the stage. And then later on in the book, you get to find out if they do get to be together, and it goes through their whole family history and family lives as well, being centered in Russia in the 19th century. And this book just really has a lot of plot twists and highs and lows, and I really just enjoyed it because it was an adventure. I felt like I could imagine it in my head as I was reading it, imagining the characters. There's a few main characters. There's Nikolai, who's a low-level aristocrat in Russia, and then there's Tatianya, who is the Duke's daughter, and then there's a few sidekicks along the way that kick into the book as well. Each chapter weaves through, but you never know. It can turn into a plot twist. There's some things that get thrown in there that you didn't see coming, but it definitely makes you want to read on to the second and the third book coming up.
Yeah, so like I talked about, the book is more traditional when it comes to vampires. So the story starts, in the 19th century, like talked about. Not those like, I guess I'm still comparing it to Twilight, where it's like you kind of just see this look of where they are now. I've never really read those books, but obviously it's set in these modern times and it doesn't go too far back. And like this book and the trilogy is going to be about this long lineage, like from the start, in these old ages, which is what the traditional look of vampires is like. If you played Castlevania, I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I think that's a unique look. I think there's not a lot of books anymore. I mean, history is like done, it feels like, just in general. Like people just don't talk about history anymore. It's always about like what happened 5 minutes ago, which is kind of sad. So it's cool to get this old, like, contextual look at how dating used to be. Like, honor was, like, a huge thing back in the times, like, back in those days, and that's definitely a huge portion of the book. And, the romance is good. I'm not really much of a guy who I don't, like, read romance novels for fun. I don't really watch a lot of romance-based stuff. Well, we do, but not in my free time. But it's still really nice. And romance isn't the main, well, it is the main part of it technically, but it's not like the traditional romance novel that you may think of. There is a lot happening outside. There's a lot of like really powerful people like in these influential spots in these old countries that are involved. And, the relationship dynamic between a lot of them. And my favorite character is actually the main character's best friend, Alexei, who actually has this like really, look at this insane loyalty and to a fault. And I think all the characters have these like really crazy faults to them. To the point where they're like so loyal to each other that like I don't know if I'd be that loyal. So it's interesting to see, but they're very consistent too, like throughout the book, which is pretty interesting. Especially I think when you talk about older characters, like in your 30s and stuff like that, people don't change that much. And I think when you see books where people are constantly shifting their beliefs and they just completely change who they are as a person, it's almost unbelievable. And there's also perspective of Tatianya, who in the book is very young, and she is molded crazy like, and it's change through love and like your relationships with people, which is also a very realistic view. So the characters aren't really the most likable people in the world, but I think that's totally okay. Like, you shouldn't make likable characters in a book just because like you think people like them. Like, I know it's a very simple way of saying that, but in this book the characters have flaws, and they have deep flaws, and those flaws carry with them throughout the book. And I'm super excited to see kind of what happens. I don't want to spoil anything for you guys, but yeah, those are the kind of general themes of the books that I think are really, really cool.
Yeah, I agree. I would say my favorite character is probably Tatianya, just because she starts off as this young, naive person who doesn't know where she wants to go in life. She doesn't know who she wants to love, and she's kind of in between. She's in a really struggle spot in her life, and then throughout the book you see her really mature into this young adult that she's supposed to be while finding herself. She begins being very lost in the beginning, and then by the middle, towards the end of the book, she comes as a very mature and finds out not only the meaning of life, not as her life is changing in such a drastic way, but also just who she is as a woman and who she wants to become as a woman. And like Spencer said, we don't want to unreveal the plot twist or the further books, but definitely go check out this series because it is definitely a great book, and I would definitely recommend it. Super proud of my mom. It's been a long time in the making, and it was a really good read, and we can't wait to read the second and third one.
Yeah, the book, as you can see here, it's a good length. It's not a short read, but it's I went through it in I think 3 days. So I guess I may read a little faster than most people. I probably read like, I don't know, 300 pages or around, like if I'm actually reading maybe like 4 hours, I'll probably get through like 200 pages, 250 a day. So it's a little quicker for me. But one thing I really do appreciate about these books, and it's something I've been reading a lot recently, because I'm reading through the Divergent series right now, and those books are like 400 pages long, but I get through them in like 2 days because the language is so simple, and it really bothers me. Like, especially when it comes to the romance scenes, it's like computer generated. Like, if you just took the conversation of a bunch of like 12-year-olds and you just made that into a computer and it just spat out a book. That's what it feels like Divergent is sometimes, even though I can't stop reading those stupid books. This is like much more adult themed, so that's something that I think is amazing. And it's not like a gory book, but there certainly is a level of violence to it, and a certain level of interaction between the characters that you can tell that adult wrote this book, and this was made for adults. So that's the last thing I'll say about what I really like about it.
Definitely, and if you don't like reading it, there's also audio versions coming out for all 3 parts of the what's it called? Trilogy.
Trilogy?
Trilogy.
Triology.
All 3 parts of the trilogies.
Trilogy. Triology.
Trilogy. So if you don't like reading, you can also get the audio version and just listen to it if you have a long car ride home, or if you take a long road trip. Definitely would be good.
Yeah, I agree. I like to read books on Audible too, which is owned by Amazon, so it'll be on there. But going on Amazon, being able to just search up night tasting, again, the link will be in the description, so you guys will be able to find it pretty quick. But any parting thoughts?
No, I think just overall, this is a really sophisticated book. Definitely has a lot of sophisticated language, a lot of plot twists and turns, and that's the kind of books that I really enjoy, is not knowing what's going to happen, and not only that, but also being able to see the characters develop and being able to picture the characters in my head as I'm reading along.
Yeah, so other than that, that's going to do it for today's video, and I'll see you guys next time.